I am a housewife in my 40s. Since childhood, I have been about average in studies and athletics, with normal grades. I went to a normal college and got a job as an office worker. In my mid-20s, I married my husband, whom I met through a friend, and we have a son and our family of 3. I think I have led a very ordinary life up to now. Although, as a human, I have fantasized about the dazzling world of rich and superstars, I was satisfied with this ordinary life and felt happy. Of course, I did not always feel that way. When you are in the middle of such happiness, it is very difficult to notice it. In actuality, being able to live a normal life every day is not normal. I didn't understand how content I was until it was gone. "Jacob, it's time for you to go to bed," I told Jacob, who was watching TV in the living room, despite the fact that it was after midnight. "Why? I just started watching this program. Just a little bit more." With that, Jacob would not leave the room at all. "If you stay up late until this late, you won't grow any taller." My plan was to surprise my son, who was worried about his low size, into going to bed. But it didn't seem to work very well, and he ignored me. He used to be a more disciplined child till he was in elementary school, but had been like this since he was in junior high. He didn't listen to me at all. "Well, I'm sure you're going to bed after this show, right?" My husband, who was watching TV with Jacob, then sided with him. "Sure, I will." When my husband asked him, Jacob pretended to be obedient. I was always the bad person in this situation. But it was okay. Despite my minor objections, I enjoyed spending time with my family in this manner. Jacob went inside his room grudgingly after the TV show he was viewing ended. I sat down on the sofa in his place. "I heard that Jacob became a regular member of the team." My husband spoke to me. "Huh? Really? He didn't tell me that." I knew he started junior high school in the fall and joined the soccer club, but I had no idea he had become a regular member of the team. "I heard that only 2 7th grade students, including Jacob, have become regular members. He must have gotten that from me." My husband was joking by my side. "I wonder why he didn't tell me such an important thing." And I was frustrated. He spent more time with me than he did with my husband, who arrived home from work at around 9 p.m. I assumed that these days it was simpler for him to hang out with my husband, who was also of the same sex. This was becoming more common, and I was becoming increasingly lonely. Well, I guess this is part of growing up. That's how I tried to convince myself. "Don't worry, I'm sure he will tell you about it tomorrow." With that, my husband brought 2 cans of beer and some snacks from the refrigerator. We'd eat something light and talk about Jacob and other things. We probably got along pretty well as a couple. After talking until we were satisfied, we went to bed as usual. I had no idea that our lives would change so drastically the next day. I woke up the next morning and sent Jacob and my husband off as usual. I cleaned up the breakfast dishes and did a quick sweep of the room. When I was about to do the laundry, I realized that I had no detergent. It had run out, and I had forgotten about it. I reasoned that I didn't need to put on makeup because I was only going shopping nearby. So I just combed my hair and left the house with my purse in hand. I went to the nearest drugstore and found Jacob's favorite ice cream on sale. So with that, I also bought some new cheese crackers that my husband and I were going to have with dinner tonight. And while I was walking along the street with a somewhat happy feeling, A tremendous rumbling sound, grating engine noise, and a woman's scream were heard. I turned my head to see what was going on and spotted a car speeding toward me. But the next moment, I had no idea what was going on. "Mom!" in my foggy consciousness. The first thing I heard was Jacob's voice. When I moved my gaze, I saw Jacob peering at me with a tearful face. And next to me, my husband was staring at me with a similar expression and face. I couldn't remember the last time I looked at Jacob's face so closely. Jacob used to be so small, but now he looked a lot like my husband. While I was thinking about that, "I'm going to get the doctor." My husband said that and left. Yes, I was in a hospital. It seemed like I was lying on a bed in a private room, feeling pain in my body and seeing the tubes attached to me. I immediately understood that I had just had an accident. But what the doctor who followed my husband to the room afterwards said to me was something I found difficult to accept at first. A car driven by a drunk driver lost control, ignored the pedestrian green light, and hit me. 6 people, including me, were critically injured while crossing there, and some of them died. I was transported to the hospital with significant injuries, but amazingly survived and awoke the next day. I also discovered that due to the consequences of the accident, I will never be able to walk again. I couldn't believe that my legs, which had been moving properly and unconsciously until yesterday, would no longer function. I couldn't believe it right away. I'm sure they'll move at some point. I had such a fanciful hope because they had been moving normally until now. But even though I thought I was putting in strength as usual, it was as if they weren't my legs at all, and they didn't move. I couldn't even feel them. My legs, which I used to move easily every day, were still present and visible. But it was as if they were gone. "It was a miracle that you survived. We will do our best to help you with your wheelchair and rehabilitation. Let's do this together." The nurses and doctors said so. My husband and son both had puzzled glances on their faces, as if they didn't know what to say to me. I couldn't be weak in front of my family. "I should thank my lucky stars that I'm still alive." I could only pretend that I was cheerful and say so. After my wounds and other injuries had healed and I was feeling better, I had to begin rehabilitation in a wheelchair during my hospital stay. I had never used a wheelchair before, and it was much more difficult than I had anticipated. I always had upper body muscle aches from having to engage muscles in my arms and back that I had never used previously. But my upper body was moving. It was moving at my will. So I worked hard on my recuperation, believing that I had no choice but to do my best with what I had now. Thanks to my efforts, I was able to leave the hospital earlier than I had expected. I returned home for the first time in about 6 months. When I last left here, I was walking freely. Even though I tried to be positive, such thoughts kept haunting me. If only I hadn't gone shopping then. I can't tell you how many times I felt this way. My husband told me that the accident had ruined the detergent, ice cream, and rice crackers I had purchased at the time. When I heard that, I thought about going out to buy them again. I went to the neighborhood drugstore, partly because I wanted to resume my normal life before the accident. But, as expected, I was afraid to go to the place where the accident happened. So I headed for another drugstore, but I could not get there. It was because there were stairs on the route to the drugstore. I knew the stairs existed because I often went there, but I hadn't thought about the matter at all. I had no choice but to give up and went home to do housework, which I also failed miserably at. Even though there were just minor height disparities in the house, I never thought of them as steps. But I couldn't go through them alone in my wheelchair. I couldn't get to the clothesline, so I couldn't hang the laundry to dry. I could not cook because the faucet was too far away. Because I couldn't crouch down, I couldn't clean the bathtub or the toilet. I was in the hospital for wheelchair rehab and believed I was perfectly prepared for my new life. Even though I couldn't use my legs, I assumed it would be simple to return to my old life in some way. But I realized this for the first time, that even if I returned to my house, I would never be able to return to my old life in this body. That was extremely frustrating and depressing. I didn't want to give up, so I tried to do housework every day. I could clean tables and shelves, but not places I couldn't reach completely. If I attached a hose to the faucet, I should be able to cook. It has been about 6 months since I came home. I did my best to make the best of my situation. However, one night, I had been cooking dinner since noon for my husband and Jacob, who would arrive home at 7 p.m. Because it was our wedding anniversary, I wanted to make them a home-cooked supper, no matter how long it took. I managed to make my husband's favorite beef stew and was arranging it on the table. But the wheelchair's tire got caught on a core of lettuce that I had dropped earlier, and I lost my balance. I managed to regain my position and did not fall. But I dumped the entire pot of beef stew I was holding onto the floor. I panicked and, in my rush, began to hose water onto the dishcloth. But I lost grip of the hose and it went out of control. The whole kitchen was wet, including the floor and walls. I created the most horrible situation ever on such an important day. However, I have made many mistakes while cooking in the past. Each time, my husband would come home and silently clean up the mess. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I realized how miserable I was. Then, my husband came home. He froze when he saw the situation. My husband would usually wipe up the mess without saying anything, and I would apologize to him behind his back. And my husband would always assure me that everything was okay. But today was different. He sighed loudly. "You really don't have to do anything else from now on," and only said that. I could tell by his expression and tone of voice that he had given up on me. "But there's not much I can do on my own. You two do everything for me, so I figured I could at least do something useful, even if it was just cooking. Besides, it was our wedding anniversary." I was about to say that, but "It's best not to do anything if you want to be useful." My husband said that in a frustrated tone. The tears that had been welling up suddenly stopped. There was nothing I can do for my husband or Jacob. Whatever I do, all I end up doing is getting in the way. The only thing I can do is to do nothing, to stay out of the way as much as possible. That's what I had to do for the rest of my life. My husband was about to squat down to clean the kitchen floor when Jacob came into the kitchen after coming home from club activities. "Wow, what happened here?" my husband asked Jacob to get a bucket from the bathroom. "Seriously, I'm exhausted after all the running I did during soccer practice. Do we have to clean up again?" Instead of welcoming my family home from club activities or work, all I could do was bother them. I was not sure if I was qualified to be alive. As my husband had said, I began to live my life without moving as much as possible the next day in order not to disturb them. My husband bought meals for us, or someone who arrived home early prepared them. I still had conversations with Jacob, but I rarely talk with my husband alone anymore. And, of course, we didn't have a drink at night, which used to be our habit. It was not a surprise when my husband handed me the divorce papers in summer, 2 years after the accident. I had nothing to offer my husband, nothing I could give him. I was too embarrassed to refuse. He apologized, but his face was so tired and he looked much older than his age. I had put such a burden on him. When I was writing my name on the divorce papers, I ironically remembered the time when I wrote the marriage papers. I was so excited about the glorious future I had yet to see. Back then, I never imagined, not even for a minute, that such an end would come. I would not have signed the divorce papers and would have enjoyed the rest of my life if it hadn't been for that accident. I couldn't help but curse my fate in this regard. "I will take Jacob in. You can go to a facility to be taken care of. I'll pay for it." My husband had the best of intentions, I suppose. Looking at the reality, it was inevitable, but my eyes were filled with tears. It was hard to be separated from my beloved son, but it was practically impossible for me, who couldn't even handle the housework correctly, to raise and support him in the future. I had no choice. If I accepted, Jacob will be happy. I thought so, but I couldn't respond right away, so I looked down. "I want to live with Mom." Jacob, who was supposed to be in his room, suddenly came into the living room and said so. These were unexpected words for both my husband and me. I was convinced that not only my husband, but even Jacob would get tired of assisting and caring for me. I was confident that Jacob was tired of it. "Jacob, I understand how you feel, but this is hard for you too, right? It doesn't mean you'll never see her again. So take your time to think about it." My husband tried to persuade him with that. Jacob, on the other hand, insisted that he would never change his mind. "That's correct. It's difficult. I'm exhausted from club activities, and I have high school entrance examination this year. And to be honest, I believe it would be inconvenient. But I'm amazed at how Mom continues to try despite her changing circumstances." Jacob was generally a man of few words, but when he said those words, the tears that had been welling up in my eyes began to rush down my cheeks in torrents. "It's difficult enough for me and you, Dad, but Mom is going through the most difficult part. I want to be like Mom. I want to be someone like Mom who never gives up and works hard. That's why I want to live with Mom." Jacob looked me and my husband in the eye and said so. "You are right. I'm sorry." My husband admitted as much and apologized again. But the divorce was finalized. After divorcing my husband, I and Jacob moved to a new house. Despite the fact that the house was smaller, it contained several barrier-free amenities. Every day, a care worker arrives to help me with chores, Jacob has been working hard in his club activities while taking care of me. Jacob will be attending high school on a sports scholarship. In the future, he says he wants to be a physical therapist who helps injured people like me recover. I know there are still many obstacles to overcome in the future, but what Jacob said to me that day gave me courage. I am not useless. I can do the best I can do. If it will give courage to someone else, I will accept my fate and make the most of my life that was miraculously saved. And I will continue to live cheerfully. It has already been 3 months since I found out my father-in-law's life expectancy. According to the doctor, my father-in-law only has 3 months left to live. Ever since I found out, I was so shocked, sad, and busy that time seemed to pass in an instant. But when I look back at what happened in the past, there is one thing that is clear. My brother-in-law is trying to get in touch with my father-in-law for his inheritance. It makes me very sad to see that my father-in-law's own son is only visiting not because he's concerned, but for the money. But if my father-in-law hasn't noticed, I think it's an act of kindness to pretend that the family doesn't know either. That's what I thought. But I had no idea that my father-in-law was 1 or 2 steps ahead of me and my husband or my brother-in-law. I had no way of knowing at that time. This was a few years ago, about 2 years after my husband and I got married. My husband, Kevin, and I were in what is called a shotgun marriage. We got married at the relatively young age of 22. However, we had been together since high school and have spent a lot of time together. We understand each other very well. Although we were newlyweds, we had a very mature relationship with each other, which made us feel safe. And we had been friends with Kevin's parents since we were students, and I didn't have any awkward problem with my mother-in-law. The marriage was not planned, but it was a very happy marriage with nothing to worry about. Of course, our newborn son, Roy, is very cute. But when Roy turned 1 year old, something unexpected happened to our family. It was a holiday, the weather was nice, and the 3 of us were talking about going to the park. Then Kevin received a call on his smartphone from his mother and was told some shocking news. "Your father has collapsed. You need to come to the hospital right away." My parents-in-law's house is about an hour's drive away. We just had dinner together at their house last week. At that time, my father-in-law looked very healthy. Upset by this sudden turn of events, our family rushed to the hospital. There, we were told an even more unbelievable fact. "It seems I only have 6 months to live." My father-in-law himself said this, and I could hardly believe it right away. I can't imagine that the person I am talking to right now will be gone in 6 months. It is not something that is easy to imagine. Of course, I don't want to imagine it. And I think Kevin, his own son, felt it much more strongly than I did. "You're lying, right?" There was no way he would tell a lie like this, but he couldn't accept the reality and let out such voice. But this is a hospital, and my father-in-law and mother-in-law looked very serious. I had no choice but accept it even if I couldn't. But my father-in-law tried his best to act cheerful. "We've been talking for some time about leaving the company to our sons, but now we have to move forward more quickly than we had hoped. I'm going to ask my secretary, Turner, tomorrow to start helping you learn how to handle the executive duties. It's going to be a busy time, but I'm counting on you." Yes, that's right. In fact, my father-in-law owned his own company and was the current president. My family and my brother Tony, who is 3 years older than me, work for the same company. I don't think any of us thought that the day would come so soon that we would take over as siblings. "No, I can't." Kevin has to accept reality and take over his father's will. He seems to be conflicted between that reality and his feelings as a son who does not want to accept the reality. He looks as if he is about to cry, and even I was on the verge of bursting into tears. But in the end, "I'll do my best, so you won't have to worry, Dad." As he said those positive words, it brought a smile to his father's face. "Thank you. I'm counting on you." For Kevin, he was only 24 years old. This was a very heavy reality to carry. I vowed in my heart that I would do my best to support Kevin as much as possible. But this was not the only problem that was weighing on our family. The problem was my brother-in-law Tony, whom I mentioned a little earlier. He has never been on good terms with his parents, and they rarely spend time together, even during New Year's and Christmas holidays. During my student years, when Kevin and I started dating, my brother-in-law was living with his parents, and although we saw each other a few times during that time, we have rarely seen each other since we became adults. He works at the same company as Kevin, so it's not like their homes are far apart. He simply has no interest in his family. Kevin always said that. So even when his father collapsed, Tony said, "It's probably not that a big deal anyway," and didn't come to the hospital. After getting out of the hospital, my mother-in-law grew impatient and told him, "Dad only has 6 months to live." And he finally came back home. If you just hear that, it sounds like a son who had no interest in his family finally came back home when he heard his father's life expectancy. But the truth is, that was not the case at all. Of course, everyone in the family thought it was purely true at first. "I was relieved that my brother was worried about my father too," said Kevin. But as I watched my brother-in-law's attitude and behavior, I gradually came to realize that this was not the case. My father-in-law is basically in bed the entire time to rest, and my brother-in-law actively took care of him, as if the past was a lie. But from time to time, he says, "The next president of the company is me, since I'm the eldest, right? Hurry up and give me the rights. How much of your inheritance will I get? Of course, the eldest son will get the most, right? The burden on me will be greater." He starts talking about things that involved money. There was almost no sign of concern for his father's health or hope that he would live as long as possible. Both Kevin and his mother seemed to be growing distrustful, and I would be lying if I said I did not feel the same way. My brother-in-law is trying to get in with his father for his inheritance. Even I felt it was very sad, since they are real father and son. Kevin and his mother seemed to feel it even more. I wasn't sure if my father-in-law was aware of it or not, because, of course, I couldn't say it, that your son is being kind to you because of your inheritance. If my father-in-law was unaware of it, then it would be an act of kindness for my family to pretend that he doesn't know. That's what I thought. Then, about 3 months after I learned of my father-in-law's life expectancy, Kevin had become quite accustomed to his role as an executive. It was time for the brothers to finally assume the roles of the president and vice president. It was at this time that my father-in-law made an unexpected comment. "Once you both assume your new positions, you'll be too busy that you won't be able to take a rest. Why don't you go on a trip to Hawaii as a gift from me?" I was thankful of my father-in-law's kindness. It was true that Kevin became very busy after he found out that his father did not have a long time to live. He was not able to spend much time with Roy, whom he had cherished until then. But that was also because Kevin was trying his best not to make his father-in-law worry. I really wanted to help, but I would be lying if I said I didn't feel lonely. But we couldn't leave my father-in-law, who was dying, and go to Hawaii with the three of us. It was not that kind of mood. While we were enjoying ourselves in Hawaii, my father-in-law was suffering. I couldn't enjoy myself thinking about that, and there was no guarantee that something would not happen during the trip. After all these considerations, I could not make the choice to go on the Hawaii trip. And of course, Kevin felt the same way. We chose to stay with my father-in-law instead of accepting his hospitality. But on the other hand, my brother-in-law did the exact opposite. Really? My dad is so generous. I'm going to make an appointment right away. My brother-in-law was overjoyed and left for Hawaii with his wife the next week. It is impossible to measure my brother-in-law's feelings toward his father only by whether or not he accepts his father's generosity. But because of the things he has said and done up until now, I knew he wasn't worried about his father. I can't deny that I thought that way. Well, of course, I said it out loud. Did Tony go? After my brother-in-law left for the airport to go to Hawaii, my father-in-law asked my mother-in-law in front of our family. Yes, he went. When my mother-in-law answered, my father-in-law got up from his bed and said, Okay, let's get started. My father-in-law, who had recently lost some of his strength, was finding it increasingly difficult to speak. But he was speaking clearly, and he was getting up on his own, which really surprised both Kevin and me. Dad, are you feeling better today? Please don't go hard on yourself. My father-in-law laughed and said to Kevin and me as we hurried over to him, Oh, it's all right. I'm sorry I startled you two by keeping this a secret. I was relieved, but also couldn't hide the confusion at the same time as my father-in-law laughed as if he had been in good health this whole time. What in the world is going on? To our confusion, my father-in-law said something even more shocking. First of all, I have to apologize. It was actually a lie that I was sick and had little time to live. I am sorry for making you worry. What? What? We were worried from the bottom of our hearts. No wonder Kevin was angry. What do you mean by lying? There are things you are allowed to do and things you aren't. In just a short amount of time, we would have to say goodbye forever. That was what I thought. So of course, I felt relieved to know that it was not true. But I couldn't help but wonder why my father-in-law had told such a vicious lie. I can understand Kevin's feelings that he could not easily forgive. Then, after bowing deeply, my father-in-law told me the truth. He had hoped that his sons, Kevin and Tony, would one day take over the company. As he grew older, he had been thinking about what was the best way to leave it to them. Because, if it was the natural course of events, he would have left it to his eldest son Tony. He was still unsure if that was the right thing to do, given his daily conduct and attitude toward his work. However, it was predictable that Tony would not be satisfied if just left it to his second son, Kevin, all of a sudden. So he decided to test them both unannounced, and that was the beginning of the lie. I felt really bad about it because it was unforgivable to tell such a cruel lie about now little time I had left to live. But that is how much I love this company. I want you to understand that. Kevin was angry with him, but I guess he understood his strong feelings because he had seen his father up close all the time. Once he heard that much, he said nothing more. And because I understood the danger of my brother-in-law distrusting even his own father, I was convinced and listened to. The result of the 3 months-long play is exactly as you both feel. Tony is only concerned about the inheritance and his position in the company, and his efforts to help the company grow and his consideration for the family was nowhere to be found. In that respect, Kevin, you were exactly as I had expected. Despite me having some worries about you as my son, You always thought about what you could do for the company and acted accordingly. And you took very good care of me, even though I was such a liar. Employees are family in a sense, and being considerate of the family is the most important thing as a president. You made me believe from the bottom of my heart that the order of birth is irrelevant when entrusting a company. I would like to ask you, Kevin, to be the next president. I am truly sorry I deceived you, but will you do me a favor? Looking at Kevin's expression, he probably hasn't forgiven him for lying. But I'm sure he understands, as much as I do, why his father had to go to such length. So Kevin's answer is, I'll do my best so my dad won't have to worry. It was the same time as when he found out his father's life expectancy. Perhaps this was Kevin's best effort to show his sincerity. Then, while Tony was away, preparations for Kevin to become the next president of the company were made at a rapid pace. By the way, the reason he mentioned the Hawaii trip was because there were two reasons for staying, for the company and for the family. So, as a final test, he wanted to see what kind of behavior each of them would take. It seems that Kevin and Tony's behavior was just as my father-in-law expected. And there was another reason for sending Tony on the Hawaii trip. It was obvious that Tony would not keep quiet if he knew that Kevin, the second son, was going to become the president. So he wanted to finish everything while he was away and report it after the fact. So, during the 10 days that Tony wasn't in Miami, he reported to the affiliate companies about the replacement of the president. Of course, they announced it within the company, but also had a small inauguration party as well. As a wife, I couldn't do nothing, and everyone in the family was very busy. However, my father-in-law, who was the former president of the company, had a lot of trust in me. Kevin's hard work up to this point had been recognized by those around him. So Kevin was able to start his life as the next president in a welcoming mood. Being president at the age of 24 really shouldn't have made people uneasy. It was a relief for both Kevin and me to be warmly welcomed. But that's how hard Kevin had worked, so I was very proud of him. And then, when Tony came back from Hawaii, he found out about the situation in the company and, as expected, said, "Hey, what in the world is going on? You haven't even passed away yet. Why is my brother Kevin the president without my permission?" My brother-in-law came to the president's office. As Kevin was discussing about the president's inauguration speech with my father-in-law and me, Kevin looked at Tony with a slightly awkward expression. "Why are you even standing up? What's going on?" My father-in-law explained everything to my puzzled brother-in-law. Tony would have never imagined that his father had lied to him and tested his siblings. Naturally, he looked furious and confused. But, "I feel really bad about deceiving you, but the difference between you and Kevin's feeling toward the company is obvious. You can't argue with that, can you? I decided that even though you're my eldest son, I am not comfortable entrusting the company to you. That's all." As expected, there seemed to be no words to reply to his father. "Damn it, Dad!" as Tony spat out and walked out of the president's office. And of course, he resigned from the company, saying that he couldn't work for his brother. And of course, he stopped visiting my father-in-law. Turns out, he really was after his inheritance. When I think about it, I realize that it was a good thing that Kevin became the president after all. It was just as my father-in-law had said. A person who does not take care of his family also neglects his employees. After several years as president, Kevin seems to have forgotten that he is the president of the company, since he values his time with the employees so much. In addition to his duties as president, he continues to take on some of the work he did when he was an ordinary employee. He tries to be close to his employees by working in the same way as they do. As president, I am still only half a man, and there are still things that go wrong. He says so. But I am sure that Kevin will be a warm and trustworthy president. Maybe there's a bit of his wife's greed, but I think so. It was a lie at the time, but the day will surely come when I have to say goodbye to my precious family. We are living our lives to the fullest today, so that we can give them peace of mind at the time. I didn't like my dad very much. He worked as a builder, had a few days off, and always came to work in muddy work clothes. When he came home, he would come home with his dirty clothes even dirtier. Moreover, his hair, face, and even the palms of his hands were covered in mud. He would take off his dirty clothes at the door and head straight to the bathtub when he arrived home. When I was little, I saw this and did the same thing several times. But every time I did it, my mom got angry with me, and I stopped doing it after that. As a kid, I was frustrated because my dad was allowed to do such a thing and I wasn't. But as I grew older, I could see that his behavior was insane. Then there was the time when I had my friends around and my dad was naked and unconcerned. I was so embarrassed by this that I disliked my dad even more. After that happened, "Dad, take your clothes off in the bathroom only," I began telling him in a firm tone. But he didn't care about what I said. "My bad." With that, he only laughed. The next day, he did the same thing again. My friends who met my dad always had a lot to say about him. The fact that it wasn't bullying was the only thing that saved me. "Your dad is funny." I knew my friends said that without offense. But to be honest, I didn't like it. Because my dad was like that, I assumed he was interesting to my friends. They must have assumed he was an excellent dad who was humorous and took me out to play. But that was not true at all. I never went anywhere with my dad. When I heard my friends talk about it, it sounded like it was typical for the entire family to go somewhere together on Sundays when the father had the day off. As I watched my friends talking so happily, I was saying to myself that I wanted to go hang out with my dad as well. When I was in elementary school, I even tried to tell my mom about it, but "Your dad is busy." She would say that every time. My mom did play with me, but since she did not have a driver's license, we could not go out far. My dad appeared to work from early dawn until late at night, with few days off. And his days off were irregular. On rainy days, he occasionally had a day off, although he typically stayed at home. On his days off, he was usually drinking alcoholic beverages in the morning, chilling in front of the TV. I think it's safe to say he was a typical lousy dad. I have seen several TV programs featuring such dads. Most of the time, such fathers were depicted as horrible people. I guess my dad was better in that he didn't raise his hand to me, but I still didn't like him. As a result, I couldn't imagine him hanging out with me at all. But now that I think about it, I hated my dad because I may have been lonely. Well, I remember feeling lonely only when I was a kid. By the time I reached junior high school, I had completely given up on my situation. I didn't want my dad to play with me at all. I didn't want to look at him because he was either dirty or naked when I saw him. Then, one day, it was raining. It was a rainy day, so Dad was off for the first time in a while. As usual, he was lounging around in front of the TV with a drink in his hand. I was studying in the living room. I couldn't help but watch the TV because it was in the living room. I gave up and studied for the exam. Then, "It stopped raining, so why don't you go out with Oliver once in a while?" My mom said that to my dad. I was surprised by her words. My mom, who had never said anything to my dad before, suggested he go out with me for the first time. I was going to tell her that it was all right because I had school work to complete. But I was curious to hear what my dad would say, so I waited for his words. Then he turned to me and said, "Oliver, is there something you want to do with me?" He laughed. I was speechless at the sudden question. I had hoped to go out with him someplace in the past, but I didn't have a specific location in mind, and I was a youngster at the time. It was embarrassing to be asked, and my thoughts went blank. So, without thinking, "I prefer to be alone. Besides, I'm now studying for an exam." I told him that. Hearing those words, he only laughed, and then, "You don't enjoy hanging out with me, right?" He spoke to me. I didn't even respond. Well, to be precise, I couldn't respond, because what my dad said was right on the mark. I don't think I would have enjoyed playing with my dad at that time. I wished he had asked me that when I was younger. I thought so in my head, but I didn't say it out loud because it was pointless. I couldn't respond clearly, so I just kept silent. Then my dad said, "I'm going to get some more beer," and went to the store. In the living room, where we were alone, Mom said to me, "I couldn't say it well. I'm sorry." I was surprised at her words. I wondered if Mom had always been worried that I was lonely. Maybe she'd been waiting for the right opportunity to unite my dad and me for years. "Who cares? I don't want to play with Dad anymore." I wasn't trying to act tough or anything. It was my honest feeling. But my mom still had a look of disappointment on her face. "Oliver, you don't think much of your dad, do you? I wish I could have asked him when you were younger." She said so. I wasn't trying to hide my feelings for my dad. But when my dad told me that sadly, I didn't know what to say. In the first place, there was no need for Mom to be so sad. It was all my dad's fault that he was filthy, lacked common sense, and didn't care about the family. "Really, it's okay. You don't need to apologize. It's all the same to me whether Dad's here or not. There's nothing I want him to do for me. Don't worry about it." Whenever my mom looked sad, I felt anger toward my dad. So I told her in a somewhat aggressive tone. In the end, I felt awkward, so I put away my study materials and went back to my room. A few days later, I had a day off from school, so I decided to go to a big bookstore a little farther away. It was an hour away by train. "Do you want me to go with you?" my mom asked me. "I'm already in 8th grade. I'll be fine." With that, I got out of the house alone. Actually, it was my first time traveling such distance by train by myself, so I was a little nervous. But I was more excited because I felt like an adult. I rode the train for an hour and exited at a station that was considerably larger and more outstanding than our local station. After consulting the map provided at the station and the notes on my cell phone, I headed to my destination, a bookstore. I walked about 5 minutes from the station. Then, on the construction site of a high-rise building, I discovered the name of the company where my dad was working. I wish I didn't have to travel so far to think about him. I stopped and looked at the site. Then, I thought I heard a familiar loud voice from far above me. When I looked up towards the voice, I could see 2 or 3 people standing there. But I wasn't close enough to see their faces. But I recognized him. My dad was the man who moved his hands and feet the most to work. There was no way I could have mistook someone I'd known for 14 years for someone else. When he came down a little bit, I began to get a clearer picture of my dad. He was dressed in his typical dirty work clothes, with a lifeline securely wrapped around him and a helmet, and his face was dirty. I had never seen my dad working. He was just sitting out at home before, but now he was a whole different guy, working as hard as he could. I didn't want to believe it, but when I saw that, I thought my dad was cool. I would have been too scared to even climb up that high. But he was working there without fear and hesitation. His clothes and face were always dirty, indicating that he worked in such a demanding area that he had a little time to care for his appearance. He drank and lounged on his days off, since he was constantly on edge at a dangerous job site. He probably wanted to relax at home, at least. He never complained at home, even though he was doing such a hard job. Perhaps it was because of his kindness to us that he constantly smiled at home. My dad was not lazy. I hated him because I'd only seen one aspect of him. I didn't care whether he was there or not. But he had to wear a lifeline on his back to conduct a job so dangerous. He was protecting us as a family. All I could do was stand there and watch. And I didn't know why, but tears welled up in my eyes. I was in the middle of the street, so everyone could see me. I looked up again to see my dad, because looking down made my tears drip. He was so little because he was so far up. For the first time, I admired him. And I felt ashamed of myself for not noticing it before. Then, I saw him going downstairs, so I decided to leave. I didn't want my dad to see me crying. Anyway, I stopped by the bookstore and bought the book I wanted. I was looking forward to reading it on the train ride home, but my thoughts were elsewhere. I resolved to remember my dad's image. I had never really thought seriously about my future. I simply wanted to study, attend a good school, and work for a decent company. If I achieved that, I believed I would be able to live happily and protect my family. That's why I've been studying. But I wondered if that would really make me and my family happy. I began to question myself after watching my dad. Regardless of whether I get a job at a company that everyone admires, if I can't do my job with pride, I would be a useless dad who complains all the time at home. I had to be proud of my job, no matter what it was. And I aspired to be someone with the courage and kindness to face any challenge with a smile. I am surprised at how easily I was influenced. On this day, I decided to change my goal. I want to be like my dad. That is what I decided. I want to be like my dad, who worked tirelessly and risked his life to protect us. If I told my dad this, he would probably remark, "Don't be like me," and oppose. But I have already made up my mind. No matter what anyone says, I am going to achieve this goal. But I don't want my dad to know about it. I've learned that it's cool to be a guy who doesn't talk much. I don't know what path I will take from now on. I will undoubtedly make my own decisions, regardless of the road I choose, and I will be a person who can be proud of his job. Then I'll have a drink with my dad. Maybe we can have a one-on-one talk about jobs and living. If that happens, "You don't enjoy hanging out with me, right?" I'm sure he won't say that. Looking forward to that day, I decided to do my best.